Welcome to the next lesson of this computer-based training on the Spring Framework. My name is Michael, and in this short lesson, we will continue to explore dependency injection and learn an alternative way of injecting dependencies, which is called setter or property injection. We will compare this to the constructor injection introduced in the previous lesson. We will also see how to use the p namespace to make our configuration a little more concise. An alternative to setting the account repository private property on the default bank service class is to define a setter for it. So let's get rid of the constructor completely, which will cause an implicit no-argument constructor to be generated by the compiler, and let's create a setter for the property. In our Spring configuration file, we now have to change the reference to the account repository to be injected as a property rather than a constructor argument. The motivation behind that could be, for example, that we don't actually want that dependency to be mandatory, or that the default bank service class is a legacy class that only has a no-argument constructor, but we can't do anything about that. Moreover, imagine that there was more than one dependency injected via the constructor. It would not be clear from this XML which dependencies are being injected. You would have to remember the order in which they are listed in the constructor and list them in the same order here in this XML. The last problem with constructor dependency injection is that if you had two beans that depend on each other and both are injected onto each other using their constructors, none of them could be instantiated first. Such a cyclical dependency would actually indicate a bad design, but it is worth mentioning here as a limitation of constructor dependency injection. Setter, or sometimes called property injection, solves these challenges. First of all, it does not have to be specified in order for the bean to be instantiated, which means such dependency could be optional. This would also solve the cyclical dependency issue because Spring would instantiate the bean first and then inject the properties. Secondly, the name of the property being injected is specified so that the configuration is a bit more readable. Finally, if this wasn't your code and there were setters but no constructors, setter dependency injection would be the only way to inject the dependencies. So now I've changed the configuration to use property or setter injection, and I'm going to run the test to verify that it still passes. So far, we've been introduced to the beans namespace that is used for the bean definitions. The Spring Framework provides many more namespaces to simplify the configuration. One of these is the p namespace that allows us to inline the properties. In other words, the properties can be specified as an attribute of the beans tag rather than a child tag. The p namespace is actually somewhat special because it doesn't have its own schema. So all we have to do here is import the namespace and change the property of the bank service to an attribute rather than a child tag. And let's rerun the test to make sure nothing has been broken. Finally, I'd like to illustrate that the property is actually optional, so let's remove it completely. The test will still pass, which means Spring was able to instantiate both of the beans defined in this configuration file. I'm going to revert this last change here though, because we actually want the repository to be injected onto the bank service for the future lessons here. So what if we want to use property or setter injection and still make the dependency mandatory? There are ways to do that, but we will take a look at those when discussing annotation-based configuration and bean lifecycle events in future lessons. For now, we have learned how to use the setter injection, we've discussed some of the differences to constructor injection, and we've learned how to simplify the configuration using the p namespace. Thank you for your attention and goodbye.